Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In today's episode, I will be continuing the Albert Pierrepoint series. For Albert Pierrepoint, each execution was a solemn duty, and it was not his place to question the morality of the punishment, nor was he to second-guess the guilty verdict issued by a jury in a court of law. He had been entrusted to carry out the sentence, and he was sworn to fulfil his duty no matter the individual's creed, colour or gender. Between 1900 and the abolition of the death penalty in 1965, 12 women would be sent to the gallows for murder, although a further 131 women would be reprieved. Of those 12, Albert Pierrepoint was to assist in the hanging of one and be the lead executioner on 3 others. Over the next few episodes, I shall cover each of these cases. In today's episode, I will cover the case of the woman whose execution would be the first female hanging Albert would witness while working as an assistant for his uncle and lead executioner at the time, Thomas Pierrepoint. On the 16th of April 1936, Albert Pierrepoint would witness his first female execution while working as his Uncle Thomas's assistant. The pair travelled to Birmingham to carry out the sentence of Dorothea Waddingham, a 36-year-old who would be the only woman to be executed within the walls of Birmingham prison. Her impending death caused a vast crowd to gather outside the gates. Some were there due to macabre curiosity, while others came to protest against what they deemed to be a barbaric act, with many chanting, quote, "Stop this mother murder." Dorothea Waddingham was the mother of 5 children, with her eldest being 9 years of age, while her youngest was a 5-month-old baby, whom she was still nursing. It was the fact that she was a mother that had influenced the calls for mercy. She was, by all accounts, a doting mother, and the care she showed her children was never called into question. Her caring nature carried over into her role as a nurse, but it was this position that led to her demise. Throughout her life, Dorothea would live on the verge of poverty. Born into a poor farming family on the 21st of June 1899 on the outskirts of Nottingham, she would not, however, possess the name she would be remembered by until a year later, when her parents married and Dorothea was given the surname Waddingham. Like many children at the beginning of the 20th century, Dorothea would leave her mandatory schooling at around 12 years old and took up employment in a factory where the youngster would toil until she gained employment at the Burton-on-Trent Workhouse Infirmary, where she operated as a maid on the wards. It was while assisting in maintaining the cleanliness of the wards that Dorothea claimed she gained her nursing skills, learning how to care for the sick, elderly and infirm, although she allegedly did not acquire any official qualifications in the field. In 1925, Dorothea would have her first brush with the law, when she was bound over for 12 months for the theft of 2 dresses using false pretences. It was also in this year that the 25-year-old would meet Thomas Leach, and the pair would be married shortly after their romance began. Thomas was a jovial man who was well liked by the community, particularly amongst the patrons at the public house where he worked. And though he was almost twice Dorothea's age, there was no signs that their union would have boosted her social status or benefited her financially. On the contrary, the couple would encounter a great deal of hardship during their marriage. With limited funds, the newlyweds would start their married life sharing a home with his sister, before moving in with his elderly parents. By 1929, the couple had 2 sons, Edwin and Alan, and had moved into a new home in West Bridgford near Nottingham. Yet the financial burden of caring for their children was deepened by Thomas's declining health, which had forced him to give up work. Whether she was driven by desperation or compulsion, Dorothea would find herself on the wrong side of the law once more, when she entered a shop in the guise of a wealthy woman, and purchased £500 worth of goods. She paid for these using a cheque, which subsequently bounced. For this offence, Dorothea was charged with obtaining goods through fraudulent means, and was placed on probation for 2 years. Just a year after this offence, Dorothea would commit further crimes. This time she would employ a nursemaid to care for her sons, telling the young woman that she had recently inherited £6,000 from her father, perhaps as a way to convince the nursemaid that she had the means to pay the young lady's wages. Suspicions, however, arose when the employee noticed the family's meagre existence, with food being scarce and the rent going unpaid. After a couple of months in Dorothea's employment, the nursemaid was owed £9 in wages, over £700 in today's money, and to her dismay the young woman learned that a watch she had been entrusted with had been pawned by a friend of Dorothea's who had been living in the family home at the time. The watch was reported as stolen, and the friend who had pawned it was sentenced to 2 months in prison, while Dorothea, who had confessed to accepting the money from the transaction, was ordered to serve 3 months' hard labour. By 1933 the couple had welcomed their third child, Mary, and the family also took in a lodger, Ronald Sullivan, a friend of Thomas's, whose home life had fallen apart. For Dorothea, Ronald proved to be a much-needed support, as her husband's health had deteriorated further, with him being diagnosed with throat cancer. Thomas's life slowly ebbed away, and Dorothea struggled to divide her time between working as a nurse, caring for the home, being a mother, and tending to her husband. The latter being a role Ronald Sullivan recalled taking on, providing care for his friend during his final days, stating, quote, "I cannot attempt to describe his last days. Those 8 weeks during which Leach was dying from cancer of the throat, a period where I nursed him constantly in an upper room, while she worked night and day attending to her patients, her children, and her home." Upon his death, Dorothea needed to provide for her 3 young children, and made the decision to move home, this time to 32 Devon Drive in Sherwood, Nottingham. The large semi-detached home offered her the chance to operate a private nursing home, with Ronald Sullivan moving in to assist in the running of the new establishment. There were 2 issues with her plan. Firstly, although she was primarily referred to as Nurse Waddingham, having reverted to her maiden name following her husband's death, Dorothea had no formal training as a nurse. The other issue was that she never received a license to operate a nursing home from her property. However, this didn't seem to raise concerns, perhaps due to her prolonged experience working in the workhouse infirmary, in one instance helping care for smallpox sufferers during an outbreak in the area. She had also established a good reputation with doctors, who would later tell the court that they were unaware of any mistreatment or dissatisfaction amongst those she cared for. As such, Dorothea Waddingham was allowed to care for the elderly and infirm within the comfort of her own home. In January 1935 there was 1 patient at the home on Devon Drive, a Mrs. Kemp, whose deteriorating health had led to her requiring a prescription of morphine to help manage her pain. With just 1 resident to care for, the home was able to take on new patients. This time a mother and her daughter, Louisa and Ada Baguli. Louisa was nearly 90 years of age, and had become a widow in 1929, leaving her to care for her disabled daughter Ada alone, with the only additional help coming from the fortnightly visit made by Mrs. Blagg, who was the honorary secretary of the County Nursing Association, as well as visits from the family doctor, Mr. Jacob, who had been caring for the pair for 20 years. Over this time, Ada's condition had grown progressively worse, with her being diagnosed with creeping paralysis, now known as multiple sclerosis. It primarily affected her spine before spreading to her legs, and by the time she moved to Devon Drive, her arms were succumbing to the condition, with Ada barely able to lift a drink to her lips. Miss Blagg had become increasingly concerned for the mother and daughter. As Louisa grew frailer with age, she was finding it harder to provide Ada the care she required, and the situation would become more concerning when Ada accidentally knocked over a lamp, causing a fire in the home. Realising that the pair needed additional support, Miss Blagg, in her role as part of the Nursing Association, sought out a home for the mother and daughter, where they could be cared for in comfort and safety. And this search led Miss Blagg to the door of Devon Drive on the afternoon of January the 5th, 1935. She was greeted by Ronald Sullivan, who advised that Dorothea was not home. However, he would discuss the issue in her absence. During their meeting, Ronald and Miss Blagg discussed the care Ada and Louisa required, and after being shown the rear room of the property, it was deemed sufficient for the mother and daughter. Having agreed that the home was suitable, Ronald accepted Miss Blagg's offer of 60 shillings a week to provide the care required. Unfortunately, he was unaware of how much care the pair would actually need, and it would later become evident that the weekly fee was insufficient. Preparations were made to house the pair, with 2 beds placed in a room on the ground floor located at the rear of the house. It boasted a window that looked out onto the small garden, which Louisa would come to love spending time wandering around. The mother and daughter would take up residence on January the 12th, 1935, for what was initially a month-long trial to ensure the pair wished to stay. And following a visit from Miss Blagg, who found them to be content and eager to remain, they became permanent residents, with them being relieved to have found a place they could be together, and also keep them away from the one place they feared the most. They dreaded living out their days in the workhouse. By all accounts, Ada and Louisa were happy, safe, and being well looked after by Dorothea, who tended to most of their needs. The nurse did, however, have to rely on Ronald to assist in moving Ada, who weighed approximately 16 stone. This was particularly necessary when it came to getting her in and out of bed, or taking the 55-year-old out for walks in her wheelchair. The mother and daughter also received numerous visitors during their stay, yet there was one notable absence. In her will, Ada had bequeathed her estate and £1,600 of assets to her cousins Lawrence Beguley and Frederick Gilbert. Yet while the former often visited Devon Drive, the latter was not so frequent. Frederick Gilbert was not just Ada's cousin. Over 20 years prior, the pair had been engaged, a situation which lasted for 15 years until her condition worsened, to the point that the prospect of marriage faded. He grew distant from her, with it being noted that close to the end of her life, Ada had not seen Frederick in over 4 months. His absence had made her doubt their future together, with Ada allegedly removing her engagement ring and giving it to one of Dorothea's children. She also stated that she no longer wished to be buried in a plot close to her now absent fiancé. Instead, she wished to be cremated. Dorothea would later inform police that Ada had stated, quote, "I don't want to be buried at Cornton now. He has thrown me over. I want to be cremated." Yet prior to Ada's change of heart regarding what should happen to her after death, other events would take place which would contribute towards the case against Dorothea Waddingham. The first of these occurred on the 26th of February 1935, when the elderly Mrs. Kemp, who had also been a patient at the home, passed away. This would not only leave a financial void, but the prosecution would later claim that it also left unused morphine tablets in the property, which Dorothea would have access to. It was following Mrs. Kemp's death that the true financial burden of caring for Ada and Louisa Beguley would be felt. The 60 shillings a week was insufficient to support them, and over the preceding months the situation worsened, with the pair requiring extensive care and Dorothea finding it increasingly difficult to cover the costs of not only providing for them, but also paying her bills and supporting her own family. To one visitor, Dorothea voiced her frustration at the situation, pointing out that, quote, "They would have to pay 5 guineas a week for no better treatment in hospital, which is really the proper place for them." With the concerns that they were not able to pay for the care they required, Ada spoke to her solicitor, Mr. Lane, regarding signing over her assets to Dorothea Waddingham in order to secure future care for both herself and her mother, in the hopes that they would remain at Devon Drive, where they felt safe, comfortable, and well cared for. Mr. Lane, however, advised his client that this course of action would not be recommended, as it could leave the mother and daughter without financial security in the future. This, in turn, could result in the pair ending up separated, or finding themselves in the place they feared the most, the workhouse infirmary. Under her solicitor's instruction, Ada Beguley had a new will created on the 4th of May 1935, in which she left the majority of her assets to Ronald Sullivan and Dorothea Waddingham, in payment for their ongoing care. It was noted that the 2 beneficiaries were absent during the creation of the document, and Ada seemed to be of sound mind, although her physical limitations meant that Mr. Lane had to assist his client in signing the papers. Just 8 days after amending her will, Ada would face one of her worst fears. She would be separated from her mother, when the 89-year-old Louisa Beguli passed away, leaving her daughter alone at Devon Drive. Despite her loss, those who visited Ada over the preceding months found her to be in good spirits, and Dorothea appeared to be an attentive and caring nurse. On the 10th of September 1935, Mrs. Briggs, a friend of Ada's for over 30 years, paid the 55-year-old a visit. Arriving at the home at 3 p.m, she found her friend snoozing in a chair in the back garden, but she roused swiftly and appeared bright, cheerful, and was able to hold an engaging conversation. After sitting together for an hour conversing and eating a selection of chocolates from Mrs. Briggs' confectionery shop, the friends said their farewell, and as she exited, Mrs. Briggs paused to tell Dorothea that she intended to take Ada out for a meal in the near future. These plans would never come to fruition, as the following day Ada Beguli would pass away, with a Dr. Manfield attending the home and certifying the cause of death as being cerebral hemorrhage due to cardiovascular degeneration. Another doctor would provide a confirmatory certificate, and as per her request, Ada's cremation was arranged for Friday the 13th of September. At no point had any suspicions been raised. Ada's solicitor was not concerned that his client had changed her will to benefit the couple who were providing her care, nor did anyone find any issue with the treatment she and her mother had received while residing at Devon Drive. So why would anyone suspect that the 55-year-old's death was anything other than natural causes? After all, she had been ill for over 20 years, with a degenerative condition that Ada had accepted would one day claim her life. Yet it would be the request for a cremation that would rouse the curiosity of one individual, who had no prior knowledge of the deceased nor her circumstances. But Dr. Cyril Banks, the crematorium referee and the medical officer of health for Nottingham, was drawn to delve into the death further for two reasons. Firstly, cremation was incredibly rare in 1935, with just 1% of individuals opting for that method. His second concern was that there was no record of the home at Devon Drive being registered as a nursing home. Wishing to address these concerns, Dr. Banks ordered the postponement of the cremation until an autopsy was carried out, which was completed on the 23rd of September by coroner Dr. Taylor, who determined that there was no signs that a cerebral hemorrhage had occurred. When Ada's organs were tested by the Home Office analyst Dr. Lynch, it was deduced that they contained a high dose of morphine totaling 3.192 grains, with between 1 to 3 grains being a potentially fatal amount. It was also theorized that due to the body breaking down morphine almost as soon as it enters the system, the dosage was possibly much higher. This led to the conclusion that Ada's cause of death was due to acute morphine poisoning, ruling out any chances of the death being due to natural causes. These findings enabled the exhumation of Ada's mother, Louisa, who had passed away 4 months earlier. During Louisa's autopsy, Dr. Lynch determined that there were, quote, traces of pseudomorphine 4.5 months after death. The doctor stated, "To me indicates indefinitely that the deceased had taken a considerable quantity of morphine or heroin or both prior to death. At all events, a quantity in excess of a medicinal dose." Dr. Lynch would later tell the court his opinion regarding Mrs. Beguli's cause of death, with him stating, "I am driven to the view that it was poisoning by morphine." With the determination that both Ada and her mother Louisa had died from poisoning, a full criminal investigation was launched, with the police starting at the home on Devon Drive. In her first statement to police, Dorothea told Detective Inspector Pentland about the events prior to Ada's death, having explained that the 55-year-old had been unwell for the last couple of weeks, with her complaining of being in pain. Dorothea went on to explain that she had been given a prescription by Dr. Manfield to help her manage her patient's symptoms, and that on the night prior to Ada's death she, quote, gave her medicine about 8 p.m. It was the last dose. This medicine often made her choke. I put her to bed just gone 8 p.m. and she spoke of having a headache, cried and seemed depressed. About 2:30 a.m. I went to see her and I noticed her eyes were open. Her eyes seemed bright. I took her pulse and it was not 30. On and off we remained with her, but as she got no worse I decided not to send for Dr. Manfield until surgery hours. She was breathing fast and seemed to rattle about 8:30 a.m. She died just gone 10 a.m. As the police delved deeper into the circumstances of the case, they uncovered that Dorothea Waddingham and her partner Ronald Sullivan stood to gain financially from Ada's death, with the deceased leaving the couple her assets in her will. They also learned that both Ronald and Dorothea had access to morphine, and neither one of them could have administered the lethal dose. This, combined with the jury at the coroner's inquest returning a verdict of wilful murder, led to both Ronald and Dorothea being charged with the offence, and the pair would be tried jointly at Nottingham Assizes on the 24th of February 1936. Although they initially stood trial together, by the second day questions were raised regarding the strength of the evidence against Ronald Sullivan, particularly after prosecutor Mr. Burkitt had presented his opening statement, in which he said, "The exact and precise parts played by each prisoner in the running of the nursing home is not fully known to the prosecution." This would prompt the judge overseeing the proceedings, Justice Goddard, to inquire what evidence existed against Ronald Sullivan, leading to Mr. Burkitt admitting, quote, "There is no direct evidence against Sullivan of either possession or administration of morphine." The prosecution continued by insisting that, quote, "There is evidence to consider against the female prisoner both of possession and administration, and there is, in my submission, evidence that the administration by the female prisoner was part of a common design and a common purpose." Despite the prosecutor's insistence that the couple were jointly responsible for the crime of murder, the lack of substantial evidence against Ronald Sullivan led to the case against Dorothea's partner being dismissed, leaving her to stand trial alone. The most crucial point of the case would come when Dorothea, or Nurse Waddingham as she was referred to in court, provided testimony that directly contradicted the evidence given by one of the key witnesses, Dr. Manfield. This would leave the jury of 12 men torn over whose version of events were to be believed. When he took to the stand, Dr. Manfield described how he had known Nurse Waddingham for 3 years, and in that time he had considered her to be a hard-working and conscientious individual, against whom he had heard no complaints, which was a sentiment shared by many of the witnesses who testified, and when Dorothea took to the stand, she was able to provide a thorough account of the care she had provided for Ada. Dorothea began by explaining that 3 weeks prior to her death, on August the 22nd, 1935, Ada had begun to complain of pains in her limbs and abdomen. 5 days later, with the condition not easing, Dr. Manfield had visited the home and gave Dorothea 6 tablets from a bottle in his waistcoat pocket to help ease Ada's pain. Less than a week later, Ada's abdominal pains had grown worse, so Dr. Manfield visited the home and prescribed a kaolin mixture, which was intended to ease the pain associated with stomach ulcers and intestinal sores. During this visit, Dr. Manfield inquired about the 6 tablets he had issued prior, and despite Dorothea stating that she had not administered it to the patient, he provided Nurse Waddingham with another 4 tablets. In court, she told those gathered that she recognised the medicine as half-grain morphia tablets, due to the fact she herself had been given them while being treated for pneumonia. Having admitted that she had access to the medication, Dorothea would further implicate herself during cross-examination when she described how the 10 tablets were given to the patient. She stated that on Saturday the 7th of September she gave Ada 2 tablets, and that, quote, "The next morning she seemed nicely, but later in the day complained of pains again, for which she gave the patient 2 more. Likewise, on the Monday evening, Ada was given another couple of tablets." Her condition worsened in the early hours of Tuesday morning, with her cries of pain waking Dorothea at 6 o'clock, and throughout the day the 55-year-old complained of pain, resulting in her receiving a total of 4 tablets that day. By that evening, Ada was complaining of feeling faint, while Dorothea and Ronald prepped her for bed, with the former suspecting that her patient may have had a stroke. But with Ada now asleep, she opted to monitor her through the night and contact the doctor in the morning when the surgery opened. As stated, Dorothea attended to Ada during the night, and noted that the patient lay quite still from about 2:30 a.m. until approximately 8:30, when she became aware of a change in Ada's breathing and instructed Ronald to contact the doctor. Unfortunately, by the time Dr. Manfield arrived at the home, the 55-year-old had already passed away. Believing the death was of natural causes, Dr. Mansfield did not suspect any wrongdoing, with concerns only being raised upon completion of the autopsy, which found high traces of morphia in Ada's system. The court was told that when provided with this information by the police, Dorothea did not react, and openly expressed that she wasn't surprised by the findings, as Ada had been given a large amount of morphia to treat her pain. However, Dorothea omitted to mention that as well as giving Ada morphia as part of the mixture prescribed by the doctor, she had also given Ada the 10 tablets which Dr. Mansfield had issued without a script. When asked why she did not disclose this information straight away, Dorothea alleged that the doctor had told her not to speak of it. In her testimony to the court, Dorothea would admit to giving Ada the tablets, claiming, quote, "I administered morphine to Ada Baguli in accordance with the directions of the doctor, who left 10 tablets with me for that purpose." However, when he took to the stand, Dr. Mansfield alleged that this didn't occur, with him stating, "There was never an occasion for the use of morphine tablets in the case of Ada Baguli. I never prescribed them. I never gave them." This called into question the truthfulness of Dorothea's words, and the prosecution added to the doubt by alleging that the morphia tablets had not been issued by Dr. Mansfield. Instead, they were remnants of a prescription given to another resident at the home, Mrs. Kemp, who had been on the drug prior to her death. With prosecutor Sir Norman Burkitt highlighting these contradictions during his closing statement, he put to the jury, quote, "If you should think on this vital matter the prisoner is again found to be telling lies, you would of course ask yourself this very important question, why?" He continued, "It has been proved in this court, and she knew it, that she was in possession at some time of that self-same poison, morphine, from which Ada Baguli died. If I proved in this court that there was an administration, therefore an explanation must be forthcoming for an innocent administration, or her guilt is beyond all question. Her explanation is, there was morphine, I did give it, and gave it because the doctor told me to. If this is untrue, as I submit it is, you may think that matter is conclusive in this case." Alongside her claims regarding the medication, there were also contradictions in other aspects of Dorothea's testimony. She alleged that Ada had been suffering from severe abdominal pains, yet the day before her death, the 55-year-old had spent an hour with her friend Mrs. Brigg, conducting a coherent conversation while eating chocolates. Added to this, Dorothea claimed that the patient had eaten a large meal the day before her death, an inconsistency Justice Goddard would put to the jury during his summing up by asking them, quote, "Can you, as men of common sense, think that anybody in their senses would give a woman who was suffering from sharp abdominal pains, so much that morphia had to be given for 3 nights, 2 helpings of pork, baked potatoes, and a fruit pie?" Aside from her conflicting statements, it was also noted by observers in the courtroom that Dorothea came across as an unconvincing witness, with her answers either being incoherent or inaudible. Yet setting aside the charge against her and her demeanour, her defence counsel sought to emphasise her caring manner, while at the same time attempting to discredit the prosecution's key witness, Dr. Mansfield. During his closing argument, Mr. Ailes for the defence directed the jury to the fact that Dorothea had instructed Ronald Sullivan to contact the doctor upon realising the severity of her patient's condition, and he put to the jury, quote, "It is impossible to believe that any person who is alleged to have administered a fatal dose of poison would be so incredibly foolish as to endeavour to get a doctor there during the lifetime of the patient, when the symptoms could have been shown that the patient was suffering from poisoning." Mr. Ailes also addressed the issue regarding the conflicting evidence provided by Dorothea and Dr. Mansfield, by attempting to discredit the latter's testimony. Mr. Ailes stated that the doctor was, quote, "a gentleman, who, with all respect, had clearly shown that his memory was not to be relied upon. The doctor said he remembered giving some tablets, but they were aspirin tablets, which he supplied because the nurse had a cold." With the defence's comments still fresh in their minds, the judge proceeded to sum up the case for the jury. As stated, he pointed out the questionable actions and inconsistent nature of Dorothea's statements. But he also highlighted her abilities as a nurse, with Justice Goddard saying, quote, "I might say in her favour there is indeed no suggestion whatever against the prisoner's skill. Her home was selected by the Secretary of the County Nursing Association." He added that Nurse Waddingham had not sought her patients out through advertising her home or approaching them in person, reminding the jury that Ada and her mother Louisa had been placed in her care by the county. He also stated that the mother and daughter, who were both of sound minds, had initially been there on a month trial, and they had voluntarily elected to stay, having found the care and environment satisfactory. He did concede that the pair were well looked after, as attested to by numerous witnesses, and the judge also agreed with Dorothea Waddingham's concerns that the payment for their care was inadequate. Having presented an overview of the case to the jury of 12 men, the judge dismissed them for deliberation, with them returning a verdict of guilty with a recommendation of mercy, a decision which they came to in just over 2 hours. It was reported that upon being condemned to death, Dorothea was led away and clasped as she was guided down the stairs from the dock. Over the preceding weeks, while she awaited her execution, her primary concern was for her children. Dorothea created a will, in which she left them some of her possessions, primarily comprised of items of jewellery. She also requested that 5-month-old Maureen, 18-month-old Ronald, 3-year-old Mary and her eldest sons Alan, aged 7, and Edwin, aged 9, should be kept together as long as they wished, with them receiving private schooling and a comfortable home. She also wrote, quote, "Tell them of my death and that I am innocent. Never let them forget it." Dorothea appointed Ronald Sullivan as their guardian, and requested that they should all be given his surname. However, after her execution, her children would be scattered throughout the country. 2 were sent to London, 2 in a home in Nottingham, and the 5th had been adopted by a family friend. It was, however, her role as the mother of 5 children that had generated the cause for reprieve. As stated during the trial, she had still been nursing her youngest child, and at one point after the verdict she had claimed she was pregnant, in a futile hope of getting a stay of execution. Yet a medical examination found her claims to be false. Dorothea's most vocal supporter was Mrs. Violet van der Elst, the anti-capital punishment protester, who had used her wealth and social position to fight against what she deemed to be a barbaric form of punishment. Yet all calls for mercy were unsuccessful. It was claimed that at the time, when many women were being reprieved, the Home Office did not afford this consideration to those convicted of murder by poison. And so, while the crowds gathered outside the prison in Birmingham on April 16, 1936, their cries to, quote, "Stop this mother murder," went unheeded within the walls of the execution chamber, as Dorothea Waddingham's life was ended at the hands of Thomas Pierrepoint, observed by his nephew and assistant Albert. The crimes committed by Dorothea Waddingham went against everything a nurse should be. Instead of caring for her patients, keeping them alive and comfortable, she took their lives for financial gain. In the ensuing years, her dreadful crimes would pale in comparison to those committed by the women Albert would be instructed to hang in Germany, whose acts of brutality would lead many to see the executions as bringing justice for the millions who suffered at their hands. And between his multiple trips to Germany, Albert would continue to carry out executions in the UK. In England, he would be called to carry out the execution of an individual who some argue should have had their sentence commuted to life. Yet it is believed that prejudice played a part in the reason why mercy was not shown. Join me next time as I delve into the crimes committed by the female war criminals whose lives would be ended by Albert Pierrepoint's noose, and the case of a transgender man whose identity and sexuality may have contributed to them going to the gallows. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.